large parts of the world, what's been happening in the last couple of years has looked like it's the either the end of the West or sort of or the sun setting.
So, Peter Frankopan, let me start with you first of all. I mean, it feels like common sense. We don't want to, no one wants another conflict. No one wants things to escalate if they can be de-escalated. Is that, do you think that is common sense, good advice not to escalate, not to retaliate?
Depends who you're asking. I mean, no one ever wants escalation, except the people who do. I mean, I think the problem from the British point of view is that our ability to influence decisions on the ground seems extremely limited. I suppose that's a function of the changing of the eras that, Britain's not the great superpower it was, although we're still a nuclear power and still have a seat on the Permanent Security Council of the UN. And David Cameron has been, I think, very good in putting the rounds in, going to talk to people around the clock to try and build up some kind of consensus. I think the problem is that crises produce opportunities, and at the moment, it looks that there are a whole bunch of potential outcomes that might favour those who take risks. That's clearly what Iran were thinking over the weekend. I think that mood has now swung pretty decisively behind Netanyahu and his cabinet, that I think are trying to now work out whether the next step forward for them is to escalate because Iran looks weak. And that's what Goldberg was saying in your clip just now too, that this is an opportunity for Israel, but also the United States, to make a decisive intervention in the Middle East. That those of us who study history would suggest that we're not very good at doing that here in the West, and often the steps we take forward send us multiple steps back. But I think that the problem is we can't really do a great deal here in London apart from try to put mild attempts, pressures on the brakes.
In terms of the attack itself, though, the whole incident and what happened, Iran launching an attack on Israel, Israel plus their allies getting involved and kind of thwarting that attack, and now this question of escalation, etc., and a response to that escalation. How worrying is this development? Because I mean, you can't always say there's two schools of thought, but some people are saying, well, hang on a sec, nothing happened. We've had a professor from Tehran University on this morning saying, well, Iran didn't really want anything to happen. It was more symbolic rather than something that was going to, wreak a huge amount of damage. But it's not nothing at the same time. So what is your kind of overall feeling about what this changes and what happened over the weekend?
Yeah, look, if you want to make a gesture, you don't send cruise missiles and drones and ballistics against another country from sovereign territory. So it obviously meant something. I think what the problem from Iran's point of view, I suppose, we should all be grateful for the fact that Israel's Iron Dome and its air defences worked incredibly well. And if they hadn't, then there would have been casualties, possibly very, very significant ones. But I think what happened in this particular case that's different is that Iran had trailed for the last 10 days that they were going to do something, that they had to react after General Zahedi was killed in a strike in their consulate in Damascus, which counts as Iranian sovereign territory. They needed to retaliate in some shape or form, and so the signalling had been pretty clear about what was going to come. That hasn't always been the case. In 2019, Iran launched missiles against both United Arab Emirates and against Saudi Arabia without any warning at all. So I think in this case, it's a question of trying to make a judgment about whether Iran needed to do something to satisfy, to get their, maybe not honor is the wrong word, but to show that they were willing to try and bloody Israel's nose after they'd lost a senior rank general in the IRGC, or Iranian Revolutionary Guard. But now the problem, I think, will be, does Israel sit back, or do they think here's an opportunity where the cards have fallen probably rather well for Israel? There's been no huge pushback either from the West or in the Middle East more widely to try to force more aid into Gaza. We see scenes that are biblical in their horror of seeing the suffering of people on the ground in Palestine, and the West either not willing to make an intervention, equally most Arab countries not trying to force their hand either. So to some extent, Israel will be thinking that there's an opportunity here, and they will be goaded and supported by some parts of the establishment in the United States that think that Iran is the major problem, both regionally but also globally. The question of how Iran sits alongside its support for Russia, for example, is a critical problem. Iran has tried to kill its own journalists or dual national journalists here in the United Kingdom. Iran as a malign influence needs some kind of solution. And I think that there will be pressure for Israel to not just call it a day and say quits, but to take a step.
China, Russia, Iran and North Korea see their status increasing while the US appears to disengage. That would probably be increased in a Trump administration, you'd have to imagine. Syed Mohammed Miranda is a professor of English literature and Orientalism at the University of Tehran, and he told us how things are viewed in Iran.
If you can bomb an Iranian embassy and get away with it and not even be condemned, then there really is no rules-based order. So the West should not speak about rules anymore. They cannot say that, oh, our embassies are sacred, but your embassies are sacred if we say so. That's not going to work anymore.
So the argument he was trying to make, which is a very partisan position, is that the dreadful West is sort of pushing these countries together who have their own set of ideals. But when I say China, Russia, Iran and North Korea, those ideals do not appear to be particularly laudable. Peter, is this a new world order? Are we seeing a new world order? And actually a world order of China, which is a hugely dominant superpower, Russia, which is more or less an unsuccessful state, Iran, which is constantly on the verge of near revolution, and North Korea, which is a failed state. Is that a significant alliance that is forming?
Well, I don't know, Stig and Asma, you're well enough to know whether you think that we should marry for love or for convenience. But I would always bet on marriages that are based on love, and I think these ones of convenience are. It's true, there is a narrative of how states will cooperate with each other when it suits them. But, there are such fundamental differences between a Marxist-Leninist state based in Beijing, an Iranian theocracy that's led by its devotion to readings of the Quran, and an oligarch state by Putin, which sort of sits at the top of a chaotic order at the moment that is keen to take interventions in Ukraine and, in fact, elsewhere. So, and North Korea sits in a kind of basket case of its own in terms of its unpredictability and, in fact, its relevance. It's a long way away from everywhere. It does provide missile technology for Iran that is extremely significant, and ammunition for Russia on the front lines. So, but it's a tiny little cog in a much bigger wheel. So the fact that the idea that these are forming an axis that actually is functional and works together in the same way, let's say, the West does, seems to me a little bit far-fetched. But I think Roger Boy is a very astute observer, I think is right to try to say that there are those narratives of how you tell what's going on are really important. And, in large parts of the world, what's been happening in the last couple of years has looked like it's the either the end of the West or sort of the sun setting, insofar as the Ukraine war, the responses in Israel and its actions in Palestine and in Gaza and the West Bank. It looks that the West is quite self-serving, and I think we haven't got a script that answers that. And that forming script, whether it's the CRINKS or the BRICS or the Axis of Evil or whatever we want to call these, they do speak for large parts of the
And what's the answer, Peter? Is the answer that we just have to stop thinking that the West is superior to those countries? Do we have to stop regarding the West as an entity in itself, or is some of the things that they do, will they actually strengthen the notion of the West as an entity in all of this? Well, where does it end when it comes? Because on one hand, it all looks very imperial, doesn't it, and a bit to be ashamed of. But on the other, we are standing up for a certain set of values that are not embodied by China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea.
Well, on a good day, that's true.
Yeah.
I suspect that that's not what the people in Gaza think. So I think that it looks like we stand up for people who are poor, oppressed, and weak in Ukraine, but we're not willing to force aid into Gaza. And the scenes that we've seen on the TV and hear about on the radio are totally breathtaking in the horror. And the idea that not just food, but children's clothing and pharmaceuticals are not being allowed through checkpoints, I think it shows that it's not an imperial way of behaving if you're trying to protect and uphold international law. I think if you're trying to stop suffering, if you're trying to have the right to food, right to religious expression, then I think that then when you stand up selectively, then there is a problem. Yeah, and I think that all these other states that are talking about how awful the West are not coming to the party with any other solutions. I mean, China's talked about being calm and de-escalating. Most of the countries in the region of the Middle East have been conspicuous either by their silence or by their attempts to say this needs a calm resolution, but not trying to get involved in the situation. So I think that the problem is not a new world order. The problem is a lack of a world order and erosion. So my own view, for what it's worth, is when states invade each other and invade sovereign territory, or commit acts of gross inhumanity and break international law in terms of food preservation, then the world needs to act as a global community. And I don't think that is enormously difficult. The problem is the dice are very loaded because of the ways in which we're trying to configure that world around us. Yeah. So, that I think is the real problem here in the West.
Yeah, that's interesting. On the point of Ukraine, Martha, just your thoughts that this is an issue that's come up today, that Britain was able to send planes up in the air to defend Israel. and has consistently said it's unable to send planes in the air to defend Ukraine. Do you think that's an issue? Do you notice that as a distinction? Is that simply because we're frightened of Russia more than we're frightened of Iran?
I mean, I think that these are incredibly nuanced and complicated calls around where we put our resources and so on. But I just like to come back to two things that Peter said. Firstly, we do need to keep reinforcing that there is a global community that can act and help deep humanitarian crises. And that is how I would say that a lot of people are seeing the appalling situation unfolding in Gaza. And this notion of the CRINKS, I was just reflecting on it when we were thinking about the topics for this morning, because in the world of technology, this idea that there has been a splintering of the world order because partly of the way that the internet has become balkanized is not a new one at all. So when talking about the CRINKS, actually something that the world of tech has thought about for a while, and a very brilliant woman called Dame Wendy Hall has written a book about this, is the notion of four internets exactly split around these countries: China, North Korea, Iran, and Russia, and the way that they have effectively created their own sacred spaces on the internet, that they have their own rules for and their own censorship and so on. So it's kind of interesting to think about the ways that technology are playing into some of these geopolitical scenarios. Sorry, I completely sidestepped.
It's not that, but
which I found far too difficult, and I've come to.
That's all right. You never have to answer any question I ask, Martha. That's totally fine. But on that internet point, then, so that's a problem then, because then you don't get free expression. You're effectively you're walling off the world. Because you don't want to have dissent there, presumably.
Yeah, well, it's kind of, it's back to Peter's point about the kind of global community. And I think sometimes we think about this interconnected world as a way of, we've all become much more and more closely linked. But Wendy's point in her book, The Four Internets, and something that people have thought about for a long time in technology, is this notion that that's just not true at all, that there is this, as I say, balkanized internet, and it's becoming worse. You have a Chinese internet, arguably you have a Facebook internet, that's something completely separate again. And then you have these other countries that are, as you say quite rightly, providing their own rules and putting their own frameworks around things. So you have to be really careful about how all these different things are interplaying in terms of a global community.